All right, Shkaya.
Yeah, welcome back.
Beautiful.
Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Tonight we're going to be starting the new parak. This is parak Amar Lehem Hamamun, third parak of Maseches Yoma, starting at the bottom of Chav Ches Amud Aleph. Tonight we're going to go to the bottom of Chav Tet Amud Aleph, of a full blot, and we overshot a little bit yesterday, which made today still a little bit easier. And then, of course, as mentioned, no shiur tomorrow night at all, and then Tuesday night, Amir Hashem back in person. Either my flight will be on time, or we'll have another parking lot shiur. We'll figure it out, but hopefully I'll be in person. So the new parak opens with more dialogue about how things function within the Beis HaMikdash. We've been discussing all the paisos, all the different lotteries, and here is what the Mishnah says toward the bottom, Kav Ches Amud Aleph, in the new parak. Let's get started. Amar Lehem Hamemuna. The person who was the Sgan Kohen was in charge of the Beis HaMikdash. He would send someone out. He would used to send someone out up to the roof and say, I want you to go check for me. Did the sun rise? I want to know what time it is so that I know that I can bring the korban tamid shel shachar. So says the Gemara, if the sun in fact had risen enough, he would say the sky is bright. Mate ben Shmuel Omer Heir Panay Kol Mizrach. He'd say that I can see that the eastern sky is lit up. And then they would ask the following question: Ad shebechevron. Is it bright enough to the point that it will light up even Chevron? And to that, he would answer, V'hu Omer Hain. He would say, yes, it is. So why do we have to do this? And what is the point of this dialogue? And who exactly is saying what? So all of that is subject to a discussion in the Gemara, which we'll get to this evening. Why did we need to have this dialogue about Chevron? Because one time the moon was so bright and they mistook it for the sun. How is that even possible? The Gemara is going to ask that question as well. But they made an error, and he said, yes, it's bright enough out, and it was really moonlight and not sunlight, and they did the korban tamid shel shachar when they shouldn't have, and the animal had to be hotzi lebeis hasreifa. They had to remove it. All of that is part A of the Mishnah. You look like I'm just trying to think of the moon back there. I don't know. It was a brightness question also. The Gemara is going to question this because the light of the moon is more like a beam relative to a spread, and that's exactly what the Gemara will ask, which is your question. The second part of the Mishnah, Horidu Kohen Gadol lebeis hatfila, that the Kohen Gadol would have to go to the mikvah. What was the general rule? Zeh haklal haya b'mikdash. They had the following rule called a mesach es raglav ta'un tefila. Someone who goes to the bathroom, Rashi says, nikavim hagadolim. If a person has to go to the bathroom, then he has to go to the mikvah afterwards. If a person has to go to the bathroom and it's just to urinate, so then ta'un kiddush adayim v'raglaim, then to return to the avoda, he would then have to wash his hands and feet. End of the Mishnah. That brings us to the top of Kav Ches Amud Beis. Opens the Gemara. We see another brisa that has other phraseologies of what it means that the sky is ready for the korban. We see Tanya Rabbi Shmuel Omer Varak Barkai, the brightness of the bright. Rabbi Akiva Omer Ola Barkai. These some of the Meforshim explain here that it's brighter and brighter by the Shita. Nechuma ben Afkishion Omer Af Barkai Bechevron. This is even further down. It's even bright in Hebron, even implying, of course, it's bright here in Yerushalayim. It's even bright there in Hebron. Top of Kav Ches Amud Beis, third line. Mate ben Shmuel, he adds as follows: Hamamuna ala paisos Omer Heir Pnei Kol HaMizrach Ad Shebechevron. He would say that the whole eastern sky is bright until Hebron. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer Heir Kol Pnei Mizrach Ad Bechevron V'yatzu Kol Ha'am Ish Lamalachto. It's not only is it bright out, but everyone's already, the day has already started. People are suits and ties and dresses, they're out. They're ready to start their day. They've got their briefcases, they're ready to go. So it says the Gemara, if you're saying that people are already out to work, then it's very late in the day. Most people don't get up before the sun rises. Answers the Gemara. We weren't talking about the korban tamid for this one. What we were talking about is liskor polim kamrina. It's for people who are hiring. That's what Rashi highlights. Liskor polim. You're trying to hire workers. So for people who wanted jobs, they would also get up. The early bird gets the worm. If they wanted a job, they'd be out in the marketplace, and those who were the employers would go find the employees and try to hire them. So that's what this last phrase was talking about. That brings us to 8 lines down on Kav Ches Amud Beis. And seemingly out of the blue, the Gemara says, Amar of Safra, Tzlusei de Avram, Miki Mishachre Kosle. The prayer of Avraham is from when the walls are darkened. So first of all, this is talking about Mincha, but it's a little strange because the Gemara in Maseches Brachos said that Avram was Shacharis and Yitzchak was Mincha. So that's a good question why it is this way. Nevertheless, it is this way. The Meforshim here do try to grapple with this. One of the Meforshim say that it's true that we were Koveya, the requirement of Mincha because of Yitzchak, but Avram always said Mincha. It didn't start with Yitzchak. Avram was the progenitor of all of the tefillos as well, so that maybe that's one of the reasons why. But the point is that when do we daven Mincha from? So says the Gemara, once the walls darken, what are we talking about? So we're talking about if you have the sun, let's say that you have a building, you have a wall like this, and the sun comes overhead. So on my side, if the sun is right here, then this side of the wall is going to be very bright. When the sun comes right over the middle, it'll start shadowing on itself. And that's Vikimishachre Kosle. When the sun has moved to the point that the wall that was bright is now darkened, right? Shachor. When it becomes darker, then I know that half of the day is over, and then I should be able to daven. That's what the Gemara says here, is that Mikim Shachre Kosle. So Amar Rav Yosef, you're setting the standard too high. Anon me Avram Nekum v'nigmar. You think that we can keep up to Avram? Avram was Avram. We can't do things like him. So says the Gemara, Amar Rava. Tana Gamar me Avram. First of all, the Brisa says we learn from Avram, and second of all, if the Mishnah says that we're not going to, not only that, the Tanya, what does the Brisa write? We know that by Bris Milah, the 8th day is the ideal day. It's not the only day, but it's the ideal day. And on that day, within that one day, there's a din of reason maktim mitzvahs. You should do it as early as possible. I think I've done one bris after a Vasikin minyan in all the years. I was supposed to have a second one, but I was out of town. Same family. They daven at brisk at the Vasikin minyan, and we woke up at like 4 a.m. in the middle of a summer, whatever it was, very early. And then the next baby, I was out of town. Mazel tov. I'm sorry that I missed the bris, but I got a lot more sleep that night. So here, that's what it says here. For the reason Makdimin, where did we learn it from? Who did we learn it from? From Avram. So you wanted to say that we can't learn about the Zman of Mincha from Avram because he's so great. We learned about the Zerizos from Avraham, as the Brisa indicates. So therefore, Amar Rava, what was going on here? What did Rav Yosef mean when he was asking, how can we learn from Avram? Rav Yosef Hakakasha. This was really his question. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, we said that it's shechted at 6.5 hours and karev, and then it's brought onto the mizbech at 7.5. Why are we doing 6.5 hours? If what you're telling me is that we're able to learn from Avram, then we should have done it mamish at 6 o'clock, because as mentioned, when the wall is standing there, the second the sun tips over the wall, even a little bit, it's 6 hours. Now we know. So why are we doing the korban at 6.5 hours? Why is it should be at 6? So that's what Rav Yosef was saying, is that if we know that by Korban Pesach we don't do the shechita till 6.5 hours, must be that we don't follow Abraham on this one, because we're afraid that Abraham had more accuracy than we did. So that's what he was asking. So says the Gemara, we should have done it at 6 hours and not 6.5. Says the Gemara, my kusha, what kind of question is that? Maybe the walls of the Beis Hamikdash that we were looking at, maybe the walls were not perfectly aligned. Maybe they were slightly slanted. Maybe they were tapered at the top. And therefore, it took a little bit longer to make the walls darker. So that's what he says. Halfway down, maybe it took until the 6.5 hour mark until the walls would darken. And therefore, it has nothing to do with Abraham that we don't start at 6 hours. We're looking at the walls, and the walls of the Beis Hamikdash were tapered or angled, whatever it was, and therefore the walls didn't get dark till 6.5 hours. Inami shani Avraham deitstagninus gedola haisabalibo. Or really, Rabbi Yosef's Havamina is right that Avraham is very unique, and this language is I believe in the realms of things we don't understand. The itstagninus gedola haisabalibo. He had astrology in his heart. I don't know what it means. So it means he was knowledgeable about it. Why did the Gemara use it in his heart? Okay, good question. Inami, third possible answer is Mishum Dezakein v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva Hava. He was sitting and learning all day. So it's just a different caliber. When you sit and you're learning, you know everything perfectly when you're sitting and learning for long enough. Learning was constantly taking place with the Avos, as we will now see in this statement of Rabbi Chama Reb Chanina. We're about 5 lines before the Gemara gets wide. Says the Gemara, when they were in Mitzrayim, they were learning. The pasuk refers to the Zekanim. As we will see now, the assumption of the word Zekanim is that it's talking about those who are learning. Next, when they were learning in the midbar, they had learning. Same language again. The Zekanim are the ones who are learning. Avram Avinu Zaken v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva Haya. How do we know? Shneimar Avram Zaken Baba Yamim. Again, the same language again. Yitzchak Avinu Zaken v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva Haya. How do we know? Shneimar V'Hiki Zaken Yitzchak. What about Yaakov? First at the middle with lines. Yaakov Avinu Zaken v'Yoshev b'Yeshiva Haya. He was learning as well. Shneimar V'Enei Yisrael Kavedu Mi Zoken. That his eyes became heavy from Zoken, from learning, from constantly hitting the books. Eliezer, Eved Avram Zakein, the Yoshev Yeshiva Haya. Eliezer, the Eved, was also learning the whole time. How do we know? Because the pasuk writes, Shene'emar, Vayomer Avram Elavdo Zakan Beisa Moshe B'chol Asher Lo. And on that note, in regards to Rabbi Eliezer, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Shemoshel B'Toras Rabo, that he was Moshel, that Eliezer was holding in all of the Torah of Avram. Haya, what does it mean? Hu damesek Eliezer? What does that pasuk mean? Amar Rabbi Elazar. Shadole umashke mitoraso shel Rabbi lachelim. Great language. Shadole, he would draw up from the Rebbe, and then he would give it over to others. Shadole umashke, he would draw up, and then he would give to others to drink. That's a beautiful mashal for being a carrier of the tradition. You have a Rebbe that you draw from, you're being dole, and then you're mashke, you bring the water to the next generation. You've already been hydrated, quote unquote. So that's a beautiful language here. That Eliezer was a malamed. 2 lines into the very wide lines, I'm a rab. This is a famous idea that Avram Avinu kept all of the Torah. Shenemar, so Amalei Rav Simi Bar Chia Rav Ami Sheva Mitzvos. Maybe we're only talking about the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, which is Aleph Beis Gimel Gimel Dalet Heva, which is the acronym to remember all of them. So maybe he only kept 7. Says Gemara, Hayikanami Mila. We know that Bris Mila was specifically commanded to him. So if you want to say that Avram kept only the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, that's problematic because we know that he was Mitzvah to have Bris Mila. So fine, Be'ema Sheva Mitzvos Umila. Maybe it's really only 8, 7 of the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach plus 1 of Bris Mila. Amar Le, no, can't be. Imkei Mitzvos Sai V'Sorosai Lamali. Why would the pasuk then say that he kept Mitzvos Sai and Sorosai? So Amar Rav Itema Rav Ashi came Avram Avinu Afilu Eruve Tavshilin Shenemar Torosai. He even was keeping Dine Derabanan Achas Torah Shebachsa Bachas Torah Shebal Peh. Unbelievable idea. How did he do all of this? If you're not fully a yid yet, it's usher to keep Shabbos, it's usher to learn Torah. There's a lot of shilas that come up because of this, and the Meforshim struggle with trying to interpret exactly how it was that he kept Shabbos. Did he keep 24 hours on the clock, midnight to midnight? Was it Shkia Tetzeis? You do Shkia Tetzeis, so if you have a Goisha Shabbos, it's Chayiv Misa. It can't be. So it's very difficult to explain all of the details here, but the baseline of the Gemara, if we were to look at the conclusion of the Gemara, it would seem that Avram, kept Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shebachsa. At the 2 dots, about 10, 12 lines from the bottom of the page, Masya ben Shmuel Omer, V'chule V'hein Omer Hein. This conversation we saw, we saw this conversation in the Mishnah. He'd go up on the roof and he'd say, I'm seeing that it's bright. And he's saying, do you see up to Chevron? And the other person would say, yes. Who's talking? So Man Omar Hain, who was the one who said, yes, that's good. Good job. So Ilay Mahach Igra. If you're talking about the guy who's standing up on the roof, he's talking to himself. If he's the one who said, I can see everything, and then the guy on the ground says, you can see Chevron, that makes sense. So let's see how the Gemara plays this out. But he can't be talking to himself. Says the Gemara, if he's asking the guy on the ground about Chevron, well, he's the one on the roof. Why is he asking the guy on the ground about Chevron? How would he know? So the Gemara says there's 2 possible ways to understand this. It could be that the person talking was the one on the ground, or it could be the one talking about the roof. How do each of these play out? 8 lines from the bottom. If you're talking about the person on the roof, Amar Ihu, he would say, the guy on the roof would say, Heir Panei Kol HaMizrach, and then the next person on the ground would say, Amar Le, Hachta Ara, the guy on the ground would say, Anshe Chevron. How bright is it? Does the sunlight reach Chevron? From where you're standing, you should be able to see. And the guy on the roof would say, Amar Le Ihu, the guy on the roof would say, hey, yes, in fact it is. Good, that's one approach, that works perfectly. And here's the second approach. Maybe the guy on the ground was the one who was actually talking. Amar Ihu, Heir Panei Kol HaMizrach. The guy on the ground would ask the guy on the roof, hey, is the sky bright yet? Amar Le Ad Chevron. And he'd say, yeah, it's not only is it bright, it's bright until Chevron. Amar Le Hein. He'd say, excellent, good, I'm glad to hear that. That brings us to the 2 dots, 5 lines before the bottom of the page on Kaf Ches Amud Beis. Again, we're going to go to the bottom of Kaf Tes Amud Aleph, about 6, 7 lines before the end of the page at the 2 dots there. Let's continue. What was this whole thing in the Mishnah? The moon was so bright that you made a mistake. How is that even remotely possible? Has anyone ever done that? You look outside, you're like, it's sunny out. No, that's not possible. So let's see what the Gemara says here. Is it even possible to make such a mistake between the sun and the moon? The Tanya, Rebbe Omer, we're going to come back to this sheet of Rebbe later, so just remember that it's Rebbe. Rebbe Omer, Eino Doma Timur Shalavana, the beam of light from the Levana is very different than Timur Shalchama. They don't compare it. Or Timur Shalavana, Metamer Va'ola Kemakel. The light that comes out when you look at the moon, you see very distinct edges of the moon when you look up in the sky. All right? We're already closer to the end of the month, but at the 15th of the month, when the moon is at its peak size, you go outside, you look, it's perfect. It's a perfect two-dimensional circle from our perspective, and it has clear edges. We see exactly what we're looking at. But Timur Shalchama mifatzei lakanu lakan. He says that the sun, the light scatters everywhere. It's very different. Did I skip anything? Nope. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel Yom ha'me'unan haya. So he looks outside, and it's a full moon, let's say, and it's cloudy out. So the full moon made the clouds look like they were being brightened up by the sun. That the light would then spread out in a very wide way. So that was the concern of our Mishnah, that it was a cloudy day. It wasn't Stam looking up and he's like, oh, I don't know the difference between the moon and the sun. Everybody knows the difference between the moon and the sun. Just look at them. One will hurt and one won't. You can look at one, you can't look at the other. There's 1,000 nafkaminas. The heat, so many differences. So what we're saying here is it was a cloudy day and it was probably a full moon of some kind and it looked relatively similar and he made an error. Amar Papa Shmami, what can we learn from this distinction of Rebbe? What we can learn from here is Yoma de Eva Kule Shimsha, that when you have a cloudy day, that light is diffused across all of the clouds, which has some implications. The Mainaf Kamina, what's the difference? Says the Gemara, Lishtuche Oros, in regards to drying out leather. Namely, would we assume that if it's cloudy out, but the sun is out behind the clouds, that is considered good enough to dry? So that's one possibility. Inami, another possibility is Licha de Darash. Rava said, Isha lo tilosh lo b'chama v'lo b'chama, that if a woman is going to be kneading dough for matzah, she should not do so in the sun. What do we consider in the sun? What if it's cloudy out and the sun is by? That's a nafkamina as well. The concern was that if you're under the sun, it's going to be mischametz faster, and therefore there's a rabbinic injunction on making matzah outside in the sun. You should do it inside a closed room. If it's cloudy, how do we paskin if it's cloudy? So we would say that according to Rebbe, it seems to be that the clouds allow for light to diffuse very evenly, or at least that it appeared that way, and therefore we should have the same exact concern. Okay, so it says the Gemara that therefore she should not make matzah outside. Now the Gemara is going to go through a little bit of an agarata of some very interesting insights into different certain differences. Let's get started because my precursor is not interesting relative to what the Gemara says. Amar Rav Nachman, Zohama deshimsha kashimi shimsha. The heat that is diffused from sun is worse than the sun. What does that mean? This is similar to a container of vinegar. If you have a container of vinegar and the cover's off, so the smell is diffused. But if the cover's on and there's a little hole, the smell is very intense. So that's what the Gemara is saying here as well, that if the sun is diffused, then everything is very, very hot. That's one distinction the Gemara makes about the diffused heat. The next one, in the middle of the bottom line on Kaf Ches Amud Beis, the Gemara writes, Shavrire deshimsha kashim shimsha. Let's say you have one beam of light breaking through the clouds. Do you remember when we were kids and you had you'd have the moon stuck in front of the sun? You'd have some, what was it called? Like you have an eclipse, so some type of eclipse. They always told you, don't look at the sunlight because it's easier to look at the sunlight because there's way less sun to look at. But what you're looking at is still very dangerous to the retina. It could really hurt your eyes. So this is exactly that. But if there are rays of light that are peeking through the clouds, that's shavrire deshimsha kashim shimsha. That's even more dangerous than the sun itself. V'simanech dilfa. The same here is true by dripping water. Take a look at Rashi. V'simanech dilfa kasha zalaf hayored al ha'adam. This is like a water torture, Chinese water torture. You take a little drip of water and you let it fall on the person's forehead. It'd drive you nuts. But if you were in a swimming pool, you would love all the water. So it's just, again, sometimes having less of something is a little bit more dangerous. That brings us to the top of Chav Testament Aleph. Hirhure Avera, Kashume Avera. Take a look at Rashi. Hirhure Avera, Taivas Nashim, the desire, the cheshek for Nashim, Kashim lehakchish es besaro is worse for the human condition. Yoser migufo shamayis. It's not halachically true, but it's physically true for the body. It plagues the body worse than the maisa itself. Again, halachically, it's much worse to do the avera. The simanech recha de bisra. The same would be true for recha de bisra if a person had the opportunity to smell a food that they were enticed by, but that they couldn't eat. It drives you crazy. It's not healthy, and therefore you should try to avoid the hirhure avera as well. Shilhi dekaita at the end of the summer, that's worse than kashim. Kaita is worse than the peak of the summer. V'simanech tura shagira, tanura shagira. Then a very high oven It's a little bit cooler, but then it can get very hot very quickly. So that's how Rashi here explains what's going on with the shilhi de kaita. If you take a look at Rashi on the third line, he says Elul shul sofakais. He's talking about the end of the summer. That's kasha mikaita. That's even harder than the summer. Kasha chomo michomakais shel tammuz. V'shekvar nischamim kol ha'avir. The whole world is already so warm. The guf abrius b'chomakais shavar alav tamid mischamim hu ata b'chum kal umaziko. It can easily get very, very hot. The next case that the Gemara brings. Ishta the sitva, if a person has fever in the winter, that's kashimi the kaita, because in order for you to get a fever that's so noticeable in the winter, you must have had a really bad fever. And we know now that that doesn't really work that way. Your fever is your fever relative to your body, but we assume, just using our parlance, if you have a fever of 101, we assume that that number is more of a meaningful number in the winter than we would have assumed in the summer, because now you're surrounded by cold weather. And if you have an oven that's cold, it takes more temperature to heat it up. Therefore, your fever that you have in the winter must be worse than the one in the summer. And the one that is one of this in this list, which is very meaningful to us, is migmar be'atikta kasha mechadata. Learning something when you're older is way more difficult than learning something new. Tina bartina, making cement by crushing up cement. If you're going to replace information in your head, it is way more difficult. I have a terribly difficult time learning Hilchos Bishul, because I've learned it already, and I didn't learn it well the first time. And now every time I try to learn it, I keep stumbling over myself. Like, wait a minute, how did these all things interplay? The Shahiyah, the Chazara, I forget every time. So I call Rabbi Robinson all the time. I don't remember, like basic, simple things. I confuse them because it's already Migmar Be'atikta. That's much harder. When you're crushing up concrete, it's a hard task to do. So we started this whole sugya with the distinction that Rebbe made between the rays of a sun and the rays of the moon. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yabo, 6 lines down, Kaf Testament Aleph, my time of the Rebbe. What was his rationale? Says the Gemara, D'chsiv lam natzech al ayala sashachar. What does this parak mean? Ma ayala, a ram, zukar neha maftilos lakanu lakan. The horns of a deer. It's actually ayala is a reference to a deer. That its horns are maftilos, that as they grow, they branch out wider and wider. Av shachar, so too, Av shachar zeh, the sun, maftia lakan ulakan. That's where Rebbe got his distinction from, to say that the sun spreads just like the antlers of a deer. Amar Rabbi Zera, lama nimshala Esther le'ayala. Why was Esther compared to an ayala? So it says, Lomar lach ma ayala, just like by a ram. Rechamatzar, its womb is very narrow. V'chaviva al baila kol shah v'shah sharishona, and the relationship between her and her male partner are with invigoration. So Af Esther, she was the same. They too had a relationship that was similar to that. Amar Rabasi, lama nimshala Esther l'shachar. Why was Esther compared to Shachar? Here we're going to see two different approaches. Lomar Allah, here's approach number one. Ma Shachar sof kol alayla, af Esther sof kol anisim. That Esther was the last nace that was recorded in Tanakh. Says the Gemara, B'ha'ika Chanukah, that was a nace. So says the Gemara, I know, but it wasn't recorded in Tanakh. Nitna lichtav kamina. We're only talking about that which was canonized. This is one of the most difficult things one of the most important things I should say to figure out is what is included and not included in our canon. What's included in Tanakh and what's not. So I shared with you this discussion of this guy who told me after I did a circumcision on one of his kids that I was going to go straight to Gehenna if I didn't include Yashka in my life. I said, thank you for sharing. We got to a whole lengthy conversation. He was telling me the New Testament, quoting verse after verse. The New Testament was written like many generations after he died, after Yashka died. Doesn't have that integrity that we have, which is we know exactly when it was written. We know who it was authored by. In Bava Kama, it says exactly who wrote what. We know when they were written, and there's a discussion of what belongs in the canon and what doesn't. So we have much more of a clarity, but that's why these conversations are very important. There is a shita here in the Gemara that Esther is supposed to be included, and that's how we pass him. But then says the Gemara halfway down, I understand your drasha to say why Esther is compared to Shachar, and that's because she's sof kol anisim. That I understand, no problem. That makes sense, as long as you say that Esther is supposed to be canonized, part of Tanakh. However, according to the one who says Esther really should not be part of Tanakh, then what's your drasha about comparing Esther to Shachar? You can't say that it's sof kol anisim, because you hold that it doesn't belong in Tanakh. The answer is the Gemara, you're right, we have to make a different comparison altogether. Mokim la ki Rabbi Yamin bar Yefes amar Rebbe Lazar. Amar Rabbi Yamin bar Yefes amar Rebbe Lazar. Lama nimshalu tfilasan shel tzadikim ki ayelas. That's really what the drasha was. It wasn't about Shachar by Esther. Is why are the tfilos of tzadikim are ki ayelas? Says the Gemara, Lomar lachma ayala zu, just like this deer calls manshim megadelas karnem aftilos, that as long as she ages, the antlers continue to split and branch off and make more pathways. Af tzadikim calls manshim marbin bitfila tfilas and nishmas. The more that they pray, the more that they are able to break through into Shamayim and get what they were hoping to get for. So the tfilas of tzaddikim are very powerful. Elsewhere in Shas, we learned that the reason why all of the imahos were barren was because the Kodesh Baruch Hu nis'avel tfilas and shel tzaddikim. And the tzaddikim don't daven the way that the average person davens. They daven with a lot more tenacity, with a lot more persistence. They don't give up. And as one of my friends used to tell me, that there's a type of tefillah called azus de kedusha. That's when you daven with like this push of like, no, this can't happen. No, this is something that you need to change. And that's a real powerful type of tefillah where you try to, quote unquote, twist the Kodesh Baruch Hu's arm, but it's done derech kedusha. It's not done it's be'azus, but it's not be'azus fine. It's done be'azus the kedusha, where we know that a Kodesh Baruch Hu is one who answers all of our tefillos. So we'll stop right here on the bottom of Chavtes Medal, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom of the 2 dots. We'll pick up right here on Tuesday night at 8:40. No daf tomorrow. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Yeah.